Alright, so for this lesson we're going to be looking at how force and motion are related, and that is actually the essential question, the overall big question that I want my students to be able to take away. They have to be able to answer that for me. The first thing that they are going to end up doing, we always do this every single science topic, science lesson. I help them set up their science notebook. That way, as they're going through the experiment or I'm going through whole group instruction, they can jot down anything that stood out to them or if they have any questions along the way. That way they don't forget as I'm giving the whole group instruction. So at the top of their science notebook, I always have them write down the big essential question for that specific lesson and always the date. So I have an example that I'm just going to go ahead and quickly show you guys. So up at the top it says how are force and motion related, and then today's date, and then I always tell them just to number the bottom of their science notebook with whatever page number they happen to be on. Everybody's going to have a different page number depending on how detailed their notes were at for that specific lesson. So this science lesson is going to be split into 2 days since we only get about 30 minutes to teach our science lessons, and that's nearly not enough time for them to really dive in and understand the concepts. So I like to split my science lessons into 2 30-day blocks for each specific lesson. Previous to this lesson, they learned about force using dominoes and marbles and seeing which needed to happen first for the dominoes to get knocked over. Did they need to have a force going, or was it just the motion that knocked it over? And from that lesson, they took away that force is any push or pull on a specific object. I would give them a few minutes to discuss the previous experiment just to recall any given information, possibly look through their science notebook if they jotted down any notes, and then we would move into today's lesson. In order to kind of recall some of that information on the key terms about force, I would show them this read aloud called Sheep in a Jeep, and I'm actually going to go ahead and flip the camera around so you guys can see the story. As the story's going on, I would want them to jot down any keywords that would describe a force or in motion, and when the story's done, we'll come back and have a whole group discussion on it.
Beep, beep, sheep in a jeep on a hill that's steep. Uh-oh, the jeep won't go. Sheep leap to push the jeep. Sheep shove, sheep grunt. Sheep don't think to look up front. Jeep goes splash, Jeep goes thud. Jeep goes deep in gooey mud. Sheep tug. Sheep shrug. Sheep yelp. Sheep get help. Jeep comes out. Sheep shout. Sheep cheer. Oh dear, the driver sheep forgets to steer. Jeep in a heap. Sheep weep. Sheep sweep the heap. Jeep for sale, cheap.
Alright, so after that video of the read aloud is played, I would have them discuss with their groups, because I always have my students set in at least groups of 4 to 5 students. That way they can collaborate and discuss with their peers on what they found. I would want them just to discuss the book and see what words they found that were related to force or motion. The key words that I would want them to find are like push, pull, tug, shove, those kinds of terms. After they discussed their terminology that they found from the story, we would come back together and have a whole group discussion. I would make a list of the words on the board. That way they could see those key words of what a force is in order to set an object into motion. After this whole group discussion, we would then set into the experiment part of this lesson. In order for this lesson, you're going to need 2 eggs, one that is uncooked and then one that is hard-boiled. I always mark a dot on one of the eggs just so I can tell when I'm going back through their science notebooks which egg they were referring to in their descriptions. So I always mark one egg with some kind of colored dot, just so when they're writing down their experiment materials, they can say one plain egg and one egg with a colored dot, whichever color it is. Once they were, because they're already in their groups, I'd go around and just pass out 1 egg of each kind to the groups, and then I would instruct them that they're going to be spinning these eggs on their desks. Now, it can get a little messy if they get out of control, so I always tell them to just kind of gently spin them. They're not trying to get them to take off across the room. It's just in order to get them enough force put on the egg to get them spinning for the momentum and the motion. So I'm going to go ahead and show you guys what the 2 eggs will do once they're spinning. Like I said, 1 egg is uncooked and 1 egg is hard-boiled. So let me go ahead and show you what those 2 eggs look like. Okay, so as you can see, 1 egg does not have a dot and 1 egg does have a colored dot on it. I'm going to go ahead and spin the egg that does not have the dot on the egg to show you what it looks like when it's spinning. All right, as you can see, it's kind of hard to get this one going to get it spinning. All right, I'm gonna scoot this one over to the side. Now I'm gonna go ahead and spin the egg that does have the colored dot on it. And as you can see, this egg spins a lot faster. The momentum is quicker on this one. So I would let them kind of play around with the eggs and get them spinning to see if they can get one going quicker than the other, or if using different spinning techniques, different types of force applied to the eggs, if it makes a difference. I would give them time to also take notes in their science notebook on anything they observed, any kind of questions they might have after spinning the eggs. Next, I'm going to go ahead and instruct them that once they have done enough observations on that they're going to spin the eggs and gently tap the egg to get it to stop moving and record their observations as well. So I'm going to go ahead and show you that part of the experiment right now. Alright, so as you can see, once I gently tapped that egg continued to spin. The momentum still kept, the momentum was still moving with the egg. Now I'm going to go ahead and do that same process for the dotted egg. Once again, it was a lot easier to get that egg going. I'm going to go ahead and gently stop it. And as you can see, that egg did not continue to spin. So once again, I would give them time to make their observations and jot down anything they noticed, they observed, any questions they might have had, any key things that they talked about with their group members throughout the experiment. And this is actually where I would have to cut the end of day 1, is with this experiment, just because we would run out of time. So moving on to day 2, I would actually start back up with the egg experiment, giving them a little bit more time to go back through the experiment, jot down any extra information that they might have thought of that night. If they did any kind of research on their own on certain things, they could add that to their science notebook as well. If they needed to finish any diagrams or adding key information that they observed, any questions that they came up with their group. This would be the time that I would let them finish that part of their science notebook. I always tell them that in their science notebooks they can jot down anything that they need, any observations, any questions, any pictures, if they wanted to make a diagram labeling the force and how they pushed the egg, Any of that stuff can be included in their science notebook. Their science notebooks are for them. It's just a way for me to evaluate evaluate their understanding of the concept. And that's all that I use their science notebooks for, is for the assessment part on the objective. So after they had a few minutes to go back over their, go back through the egg experiment, play with it a little bit, get their hands on it, try to figure out anything else that might have popped up to them the second time they did it. Oh, excuse me. I would then move on to having them answer 4 questions for me. That while they were doing that, I would post those 4 questions on the whiteboard. That way they could work on those 4 questions at their own pace. The 4 questions that I would ask them relating to this experiment would be, what caused the eggs to initially start spinning? Why did both spinning eggs eventually come to rest, even when they were left untouched? Was one egg more difficult to spin than the other? And as you guys observed, one egg was more difficult to spin. In this answer, I would be looking for if it was the uncooked egg or the hard-boiled egg. They'd have to kind of make that educated guess on which egg they thought would harder to spin. And the last question that I would ask them was, did one of the eggs start spinning again after it was stopped? Which you observed that as well. If so, why do they believe that egg continued to spin? So based on their answers with these 4 questions, I'd be able to gauge their understanding of force and motion. They would be allowed to discuss with their group members these 4 questions. They can do them in any order. After they were done answering those 4 questions, I would then go over why one egg spun after being stopped, why one egg was easier to spin than the other. I would explain the process to them after they had answered those questions. So the one thing that I want to bring up with them is the key term of inertia, and explain to them that the inertia is the tendency of an object to remain at rest or an object to remain in motion if it is in motion. This is kind of a hard concept for my students to understand, as well as friction being a force. A lot of my students this year had a hard time understanding that friction does stop things from moving. They just assumed that their egg stopped spinning because it was out of momentum. They didn't realize that there was another force acting upon their egg, causing it to slow down. So I would go over the fact that the liquid part of the uncooked egg had more inertia than the hard-boiled solid inside of the egg. All right, so after going over the explanation part of how the experiment worked, I would then show them this Scholastic Study Gems video on force and motion, just to kind of review some of the key concepts from the experiment. As the video is playing, they're allowed to take notes on anything that they want to from the video within their science notebook, or if they have a question about something while the video is playing, they can go ahead and write down that question as well. Alright, so after the Scholastic Study Gems video, I would go ahead and have a whole group conversation about things that they noticed or observed throughout the movie, any kinds of questions that might have come up from doing the experiments on both days, and then from the video, we just kind of have a whole group discussion on answering those questions, going over the key concepts and terms, and really making sure that they understand how force and motion are related, since that is the big essential question for this lesson. After we're done with our whole group conversation, I'd go ahead and collect their science notebooks. That way I can go through and kind of assess where they're at with the topic and how well they're understanding it, or if they're stuck, if any misconceptions come up. I can go ahead and address those the following day before we start our next lesson. This would be how I would assess their knowledge, how I would give them a grade for if they understood the concept or not, is based on their science notebook. So that's why I'm really, I kind of stress with my students that when they're using their science notebook, jot down as much information as they can. Questions, observations, pictures, however they want to get down the information that they're observing. It doesn't matter to me, just as long as I can see that they fully understand the concept. Once I've collected their science notebook, I would go ahead and extend this lesson to kind of going over the Isaac Newton's laws of motion. This is a little bit of a higher concept for my students, but I just kind of want them to be aware that there are laws relating to motion. And in order to extend this lesson, I would actually use a Myon book. All right, so I'm logged into my Myon account, and there's tons of books online. Most of them are AR related, so they can go ahead and take an AR quiz on the book after they're done. So the book that I'm interested in showing them is right here, Isaac Newton and the Laws of Motion. You can even go ahead and click on the I button, and it gives you all the information about how long it takes to read. And it says right here it takes about 14 minutes to read. And it even gives you the AR level of the book. So this is a 4.7. So this is a little high for my kids. But once we were done with the book, the read aloud, I'd go ahead and once again just have a group conversation, a whole group conversation on the content of the book. So let me go ahead and just kind of show you what it looks like when you start reading it.
Isaac Newton and the Laws of Motion by Andrea Giannopoulos, illustrated by Phil Miller and Charles Barnett III. Chapter 1. A Young Genius. In 1653, Isaac Newton lived in Grantham, England. He loved to read and experiment. He also had a talent for building machines. When he was 11 years old,
So once the story was done being read aloud to them, we would go ahead and I would have them discuss with their group anything that stood out to them, if there was any key facts of information that they really liked, if there was anything that they might have had a question about, or if they noticed something from the story that related to one of the 2 past experiments that we had gone through, see if they can make those connections. Then we would come back together, whole group, and talk about the things that they discussed with their groups. After we were done with this discussion, I would see if they had any questions that they needed answered from the experiment. If I didn't know how to answer these questions right away, I would put them on the parking lot board and I would research those questions for them, and then I would get back to them on how to explain that concept or topic to them if I was stuck on explaining it to them. And that would be how I would wrap up this 2-day lesson on how force and motion are related.